I remember the exact weight of the pen. It was a Mont Blanc Meisterstück, the one I gave him on our 10th anniversary, engraved with his initials and the date. DW, June 14th, 2010. I had saved for 4 months to buy it. Back then, I thought a man's hands deserved something beautiful to sign his name with. He used it to sign away everything I sold 3 houses to save. I watched him do it. I was sitting 8 feet away on the other side of a glass table in a midtown Atlanta law office, and I watched Darnell press that pen to paper with the steadiness of a man who had made peace with his decision long before that room. Camille sat beside him. Her hand was on the table close enough to his that their fingers touched at the knuckle. She didn't look at me once, neither did he. And I didn't cry. I didn't stand up. I didn't say his name. I just watched. Because by the time he signed that document, I already knew something he didn't. And what he didn't know had been quietly working in my favor for 6 weeks. Before we go any further, what time is it where you're? So right now, drop your time and your country in the comments. I want to know who's up with me for this one. The first house we bought together was on Del Mar Lane in East Point, Georgia. A 940 square foot Craftsman with a cracked driveway and a kitchen that still had the original linoleum from 1987. We paid $214,000 for it in 2011. Darnell said the bones were good. I said the roof looked tired. We bought it anyway. I remember standing in the empty living room the day we got the keys, both of us still in our work clothes. He'd come straight from a job site. I'd come straight from the school where I taught 5th grade, and he picked me up and spun me once, and the sound of his boots on that old hardwood floor echoed all the way to the back bedroom. We ate cold jerk chicken on the floor that night because the moving truck wasn't coming until Saturday. We didn't care. We had a house. We had a plan. That was the version of Darnell I married. The man who ate cold chicken on linoleum and called it a celebration. By the time he got sick, we had 3 properties. The Craftsman in East Point, a rental duplex we'd bought in 2016 off Campbellton Road, and a newer build in Stonecrest we'd moved into in 2019. 14 years of 2 incomes, careful budgeting, and the kind of discipline that doesn't look glamorous from the outside. We didn't take vacations to Cancun. We put the money into property. That was the agreement. That was always the agreement. I was the one who handled the paperwork. Not because Darnell couldn't. He was a licensed general contractor. He understood contracts. But because I was the one who sat still long enough to read every line. He would sign where I pointed. He trusted me that completely. Or at least, that was what I believed for 14 years. We met at a 4th of July cookout in 2008 at his cousin Marcus's house in College Park. I was 30 years old and had just finished my master's degree in education. He was 33 and had just started his contracting business with 1 truck and a borrowed table saw. He was not the loudest man at that cookout. He was the one standing near the grill listening more than he talked. That was the thing that got me. A man who listened. My mother liked him immediately. My father took longer. Daddy was a commercial real estate investor, quiet and precise. And he had a habit of watching men's hands. When they talked, he said, you could tell everything about a person's character by what they did with their hands when they weren't performing. The first time Daddy watched Darnell, he said nothing for 3 days. Then on the 4th day, he called me and said, son, he's a worker. That's good. Just make sure he's working for you and not around you. I didn't know what that meant at the time. I thought it was just Daddy being cryptic the way he always was. Daddy died in 2017. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. He left behind a small portfolio of properties, a storage unit full of ledgers going back to 1991, and a sealed envelope with my name on it that his attorney held for 2 years before I was supposed to open it. I forgot about that envelope for a long time. I had a husband, 3 properties, and a life that felt solid enough that I stopped looking for foundations. Darnell's diagnosis came in March of last year. Congestive heart failure with complications. The cardiologist at Emory used words I had to look up on my phone in the hospital parking garage because I didn't want to ask her to repeat them in front of him. I sat in my car for 22 minutes after that appointment. Then I drove home, made a list, and started making calls. The first call was to the bank. The second was to a real estate agent named Phyllis, who had sold us the Stonecrest house and knew our situation well enough that I didn't have to explain much. I told her I needed to move the East Point property quickly. She said she could have comps to me by Thursday. I said, make it Wednesday. I was not a woman who fell apart in parking garages. I was a woman who made lists. That had always been the difference between surviving and not surviving in my family, and I had learned it early. You cry on Sunday. Monday, you make the list. I told Darnell we would get through it. I told him the house was just a house, that what mattered was him being here. He held my hand when I said it. His grip was still strong even then, even with the monitors and the IV and the particular smell of a hospital room that gets into your clothes and stays there. He looked at me with those heavy-lidded eyes and said, I don't deserve you, Savannah. And I told him to stop talking like that. I believed him when he said it. That was the part I kept coming back to later, not the betrayal itself, but the fact that he said those exact words while it was already happening. He did not deserve me. He just had a different reason in mind than I thought. The East Point house sold in 19 days for $268,000. I paid down his medical bills, covered 3 months of his business expenses so his crew wouldn't lose their jobs, and put the remainder into a joint account we'd designated for emergencies. I slept 4 hours a night for most of that spring. I lost 11 pounds without trying. My best friend Renee kept showing up at the door with food I sometimes forgot to eat. No one tells you that loving someone through illness is its own kind of labor. Not emotional labor, physical, logistical, relentless labor. Scheduling, advocating, translating doctors' speak into plain language. Sitting in waiting rooms with a yellow legal pad taking notes, because the information comes fast and the fear makes it hard to hold. I did all of it. I did it without being asked, because that is what you do when you have made a promise in front of people you respect. I did not see the first crack until May. And when I saw it, it was not dramatic. It was a phone number on a printed insurance statement. 7 digits I didn't recognize listed under Emergency Contact Secondary. Typed in a field that had been blank the year before. I stared at it for a long time before I folded the paper and put it back in the folder. I told myself there was an explanation. I was good at that too, finding the explanation that let me keep going. A man who is fighting for his life does not have the energy for anything that would require that kind of explanation. That was what I told myself. I made dinner that night. Smothered chicken, his favorite. I set the table the way I always did with the good placemats, because some habits are the only things standing between you and the version of yourself you don't want to become. He ate 2 full plates and told me it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. The number stayed in the folder. The folder stayed in the drawer. And I kept going the way I always kept going, because the list was long and the days were short, and I'd not yet learned that some foundations crack from the inside out long before you see the first line appear on the surface. The second house sold in August. The duplex on Campbellton Road had been our steadiest asset. Both units rented, both tenants reliable. One of them a retired postal worker named Mr. Greer, who had lived there for 6 years and always paid on the first. Letting it go felt different from letting go of the craftsman. The craftsman had been our beginning. The duplex had been our proof that the plan was working, that the discipline was paying off, that we were building something that would outlast the years when we were just two people eating cold chicken on a linoleum floor. I signed the closing documents on a Tuesday morning while Darnell was at a cardiology follow-up. I didn't tell him I was going. He had enough to carry. I sat across from the title company representative and signed my name 11 times and walked out with a cashier's check and got into my car and drove to the Chick-fil-A on Camp Creek Parkway and ordered a large sweet tea and sat in the parking lot and drank it slowly and did not cry. I was getting good at not crying in parking lots. The money went where the money needed to go. Another round of medical bills. A procedure his insurance covered at 60%, which sounds generous until you do the math on the remaining 40. I paid it. I did not tell him the full number. Some information is not medicine, it is just weight. And a man with a damaged heart does not need more weight. By September, Darnell was well enough to move around the house without assistance. Well enough to sit on the back porch in the evenings. Well enough to start taking calls from his crew again, coordinating small jobs from his phone. While I made dinner inside and listened to his voice through the screen door and that low, even contractor's voice that I had always found steadying, the voice of a man who knew how things were built and how to fix them when they weren't. I thought we were coming out of it. I started sleeping more, started eating at regular hours again. Renee came over one Saturday and said I looked like myself again, and I told her I felt like myself again, and I meant it. The crisis had a shape now. I could see the edges of it. We had lost 2 properties and spent more than I wanted to count, but Darnell was alive and improving, and we still had the Stonecrest house and each other. And I told myself that was the only accounting that mattered. I was making that argument to myself the afternoon I drove to Emory for his October appointment. He'd asked me to drop off paperwork at the patient services office on the 3rd floor. While he saw the cardiologist routine, he said just some insurance forms. I took the elevator up, dropped the envelope at the desk, and came back down through the main lobby instead of the way I'd come. That was the only reason I was in the east parking structure at 2:17 in the afternoon. I saw her before I saw the flowers. She was walking from the direction of the elevator bank, tall, polished, bone-straight hair, catching the October light, moving with the specific purposefulness of someone who knew exactly where she was going and had been there before. She was carrying a bouquet of sunflowers, the large kind, the ones with the dark centers still in the plastic sleeve from the store. I could see the Whole Foods sticker on the side. $47. I stopped walking. I knew Camille Reeves the way you know someone, from the edges of a life. She had been with Darnell briefly before we met. 2 years, maybe less, the kind of relationship that ends without a clean explanation and leaves a residue. He had mentioned her exactly 4 times in 14 years, always in the past tense, always with the particular flatness of a man trying to communicate that something is over. I had no reason to think about her. She existed in the category of things that had happened before me, and I had never been a woman who worried about the past. What I knew about Camille: she lived in Buckhead. She worked in corporate law. She wore her hair straight. What I was looking at: Camille Reeves walking into Emory University Hospital with $47 sunflowers in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. I stood in that parking structure for what felt like a long time, but was probably 40 seconds. Long enough for her to disappear through the sliding doors. Long enough for the particular cold of October in Atlanta to reach the back of my neck. Darnell was allergic to sunflowers. Had been since childhood, a contact allergy that gave him hives along his forearms. I had never once bought sunflowers in 14 years of marriage. It was the kind of small accommodation you make without thinking, the kind that becomes invisible because it has always been true. He had told me he was allergic. He had never told her. Or she had never been in a position where it mattered. I walked to my car. I sat down. I looked at my hands on the steering wheel for a moment, the thin gold band on my left hand, the small callus on my right index finger from 14 years of grading papers with a red pen. and I made a decision that surprised me with its quietness. I was not going to confront him in a hospital. I was not going to confront her in a parking lot. I was going to go home, and I was going to think, and I was going to be very, very careful about what I did next. Because I had spent 8 months selling everything I had built to keep this man alive, and if there was something I needed to understand about what I had actually been keeping alive, I needed to understand it completely before I made a single move. I texted him, running a little behind traffic on 285. His response came in 40 seconds. No rush, just finishing up. Love you. I looked at those 2 words for a moment. Then I put the phone face down on the passenger seat and started the car. The sunflowers stayed in my mind the whole drive home. Not the betrayal, I wasn't ready to call it that yet. Just the flowers themselves. The specific wrongness of them. The $47 sticker still on the sleeve, like she hadn't thought to take it off, or hadn't needed to, because there was no one in that room who would know the difference. There was something in that detail I couldn't let go of. The carelessness of it. The assumption that no one was paying attention. She had assumed wrong. I did not sleep that night. Not in the dramatic way, not tossing, not crying into a pillow. Not replaying the parking lot over and over until it distorted. I lay still in the dark beside Darnell and listened to him breathe and thought with the specific clarity that only comes when you have exhausted every version of the comfortable explanation and there are none left that hold. The phone number on the insurance statement. The calls at 11:47 p.m. The sunflowers. Separately, each thing had an explanation I could live with. Together, they had a shape I recognized. I had taught 5th grade for 19 years. I knew what it looked like when the pieces of a story didn't belong to the same story. I got up at 4:43 a.m. and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the insurance folder I had never thrown away. I found the statement with the secondary emergency contact number. I wrote it down on a yellow Post-it note and stuck it inside the cover of the book I was reading, a habit from my teaching days, using whatever paper was close. Then I closed the folder and put it back in the drawer and went upstairs and showered and was dressed and downstairs again before Darnell woke up. He came into the kitchen at 7, looking better than he had in months. Color in his face, moving without the careful deliberateness that illness puts in a person's body. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter and talked about a small renovation job his crew was being considered for a kitchen remodel in Decatur, modest budget, but good client. And I listened and asked the right questions and made him 2 eggs over easy, the way he liked them. Yolk still loose, and watched him eat. He kissed me on the cheek before he left for his follow-up with the physical therapist. His lips were warm. He smelled like the cedar soap we'd been buying from the same small shop in Little 5 Points for 11 years. I waited until his truck cleared the end of the driveway. Then I called Renee. Renee Thomas had been my closest friend since our first year of teaching together at Brookwood Elementary in 2004. She was not a woman who panicked, and she was not a woman who told you what you wanted to hear. She was the kind of friend who listened completely and then said the true thing even when the true thing was uncomfortable. I told her about the parking lot, about the flowers, about the phone number. I did not editorialize. I just told her the sequence. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "How long have you known?" I said, "I think I've been not knowing on purpose for a while." She said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need you to look up a phone number for me without asking me why you're looking it up." Because Renee worked for a property management company and had access to the kind of databases that cross-reference contact information. It was not glamorous detective work. It was just knowing the right person. She called me back in 40 minutes. The number was registered to a Camille A. Reeves with a Buckhead address on Peachtree Battle Avenue. I already knew the name. Hearing it confirmed out loud in Renee's careful voice was a different thing from the parking lot, from the theoretical, from the version I'd been managing in the dark. I thanked her. I hung up. I sat at the kitchen table for 6 minutes without moving. Then I called my father's attorney. Raymond Osei had handled my father's estate since 1998. He was 71 years old, semi-retired, and operated out of a small office in Decatur that smelled like old paper and lemon furniture polish. I had not spoken to him since the estate closed in 2019. He answered on the second ring as though he had been expecting me, which I found out later was not entirely coincidental. I told him I needed to come in. He said when. I said tomorrow if possible. He said, "Savannah, your father left me specific instructions about a second conversation we were meant to have. I've been wondering when you'd call." I didn't know what that meant. I told him I'd be there at 10. I spent the rest of that day doing ordinary things with extraordinary attention. I graded a set of student essays. I started a grocery list. I watered the plants on the back porch. I responded to a text from my sister in Charlotte. I did not look at my phone more than necessary, and I did not let myself sit still long enough to feel the full weight of what I was carrying. Because I had learned a long time ago that weight distributed across motion is more manageable than weight held in a stopped body. Darnell came home at noon. He brought lunch. Zaxby's, my usual order, the salad with extra chicken and the house dressing on the side. He set it on the counter and said he'd been thinking about taking a short drive up to Blue Ridge once the weather cooled, just the two of us, like we used to do before everything got complicated. He said it with the ease of a man who believed in the future he was describing. I said that sounded nice. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and ate his chicken fingers and told me about the physical therapy session. And I watched his hands while he talked the way my father used to watch men's hands. And I thought about what Daddy had said, make sure he's working for you and not around you. I had dismissed that for 14 years as a father being cautious. Sitting at that table on that October afternoon watching Darnell's hands on the Zaxby's container, I understood it differently. My father had seen something in those hands that I hadn't been ready to see, and he had apparently done something about it. Raymond Osei's office was exactly as I remembered. The lemon furniture polish, the stacks of manila folders, the framed photo of a young Raymond shaking hands with Maynard Jackson that had been on that wall since before I was born. He poured me a cup of tea without asking and set a folder on the desk between us and folded his hands on top of it. He said, "Your father came to me in 2018, the year before he died, with a specific concern. He had observed certain things about your financial structure, the way the properties were held, the way decisions were made, and he wanted to create a protection that would exist outside of your marital estate. He identified a commercial property he owned at 1142 Commerce Drive in Decatur. He transferred it to you as a gift documented carefully with the explicit instruction that it not be disclosed until you came to me, asking the question he believed you would eventually ask." I looked at the folder. Raymond said, "The transfer was completed and legally registered in your name alone in March of 2018. Your father's note to me said, and I'm reading this exactly, 'My daughter is the kind of woman who will give everything she has to the people she loves. Make sure she has something they cannot reach.'" I had not cried in a parking lot in 8 months. I cried in Raymond Osei's office, in a chair that smelled like old leather, holding a cup of tea that had gone lukewarm, while a 71-year-old man in a brown suit waited with the patience of someone who had held this information for 6 years and understood exactly what it cost. I cried for my father. I cried for the 19-year-old girl who hadn't understood what he was trying to tell her. I cried because the man I'd been protecting with everything I had been on the phone at 11:47 p.m. with a woman carrying sunflowers, and my dead father had known something was coming before I did. Then I stopped. I wiped my face with the tissue Raymond placed on the desk without comment. I picked up the folder. I read every page. 1142 Commerce Drive. A two-story commercial building currently leased to a dental practice and a small accounting firm. Assessed value, $2.3 million. Owner of record Savannah Marie Webb since March 14, 2018. I asked Raymond what I needed to do next. He said, "Nothing yet, but I'd like you to meet with a family law attorney I trust. Her name is Patricia Huang. She has an office on Peachtree Street. I took the liberty of telling her you might be calling." I looked at him. He said, "Your father was a very precise man, Savannah. He didn't just leave you a building. He left you a sequence." I drove home in the early afternoon light with the folder on the passenger seat where my phone had been the day before. The city moved past the windows the way it always did. The construction cranes, the interchange, the October trees beginning to turn along 285. And I thought about my father standing in his office in 2018, already sick, already counting the time he had left, making sure the sequence would be ready when his daughter finally needed it. He had seen Darnell's hands, and he had built me a door. I just had to decide when to walk through it. Patricia Huang did not look like a woman who dealt in other people's devastation for a living. She was small, precise, with reading glasses she took on and off, in a rhythm that seemed connected to how serious the information was. Her office on Peachtree Street was deliberately calm, no harsh lighting, no aggressive mahogany, just clean lines and good chairs, and a window that looked out onto the trees along the street below. She had a yellow legal pad on the desk when I sat down, and she did not pick up her pen until I finished talking. That told me something about her. I told her everything. The sequence the way Raymond had taught me to think of it. The phone number, the parking lot, the sunflowers, the folder, 1142 Commerce Drive. I told her about the 3 houses I had sold, and where the money had gone, and how the accounts were structured, and whose name was on what. I had brought documents. She went through them without rushing turning pages, with the same deliberate quiet, and when she finished, she set the folder down and took off her glasses and looked at me. She said, "You haven't confronted him." I said no. She said, "Good, don't." She picked up her pen. What followed was 90 minutes of the most useful conversation I had ever had about my own life. Patricia Huang did not deal in sympathy, or rather, she dealt in it briefly, and then moved past it because sympathy without strategy is just company in a burning building. She explained what Georgia's equitable distribution law meant for a marriage of 14 years. She explained what it meant that the Commerce Drive property had been transferred to me as a separate gift before a divorce action was filed. She explained the difference between what Darnell believed he had access to and what he actually had access to legally. And she drew a line between those two things on her yellow legal pad that I looked at for a long time. Then she said, "What do you want the outcome to be?" I thought about that. Not the answer I would have given 8 months ago before the diagnosis, before the parking lots, before Raymond Osei's office, and my father's handwriting on a note I had not known existed. The answer I would have given then was, I want my husband back. I want the plan back. I want the floor under my feet to be what I thought it was. That woman was gone. She had sold her last house in August, and I did not think she was coming back. I said, I want to make sure that when this ends, it ends on my terms. Not his, not hers, mine. Patricia nodded once the way people nod when the answer confirms something they already suspected. She wrote something on the yellow pad. She said, "Then here is what we're going to do. I will not detail every conversation that followed over the next 6 weeks, because some of it is procedural and some of it is still mine to keep. What I will say is this. I did not become a different person during those 6 weeks. I did not become cold or calculating or any of the words that get used for women who stop absorbing damage and start making decisions. I made dinner every night. I asked Darnell about his physical therapy. I sat with him on the back porch in the evenings and watched the sky change over the stone crest roofline. and listened to him talk about the renovation business and the crew and the Decatur kitchen remodel that had come through. I was present. I was steady. I was exactly the woman he had always known. I was also meeting with Patricia Huang every Thursday at 10 a.m. There is a particular skill required to exist in two realities. Simultaneously, the reality you are living on the surface and the reality you are building underneath it. I had been doing a version of it for years, without knowing, carrying the weight of our financial life in the same hands that made dinner and graded papers and held his during the hard appointments. The difference now was that I knew I was doing it. I was no longer managing in the dark. I had the folder. I had Patricia. I had my father's sequence. Darnell noticed nothing, or if he noticed, he attributed it to the particular quietness that settles over a marriage. After a long illness, a kind of exhaustion that presents as calm, a stillness that looks like peace from the outside, he was, I think, relieved by it. He had been bracing for a reckoning that wasn't coming, and the absence of it made him comfortable. Comfortable men stop looking for the thing they are afraid of. That was the first thing I understood about power during those 6 weeks. The person who appears to have accepted their situation controls the pace of everything that follows. The second thing I understood came from a conversation with Renee on a Thursday evening in late October. We were sitting on my back porch, the first genuinely cold night of the season. Both of us with blankets over our laps and cups of chamomile tea. And she said, "How are you actually doing, not the Patricia Huang version, the Savannah version?" I sat with that for a moment. I said, "I keep thinking about the sunflowers, not because of what they mean, because of the $47 stickers she didn't take off. That's the detail that stays with me." Renee said, "Why that one?" I said, "Because it means she wasn't being careful. And if she wasn't being careful, he wasn't asking her to be. And if he wasn't asking her to be careful, it means he wasn't afraid of being seen." Renee was quiet. I said, "A man who isn't afraid of being seen has already made a decision about the person who might see him." We sat with that for a while. The cold came in off the tree line, and the tea went warm in our hands, and somewhere down the street, a neighbor's dog barked twice and stopped. Renee said, "Your daddy would be proud of you." I didn't answer that. I wasn't sure pride was the right category for what I was doing. I was not being brave. I was being precise. Those are different things, and I had learned the difference from a man who read contracts line by line and never once confused sentiment with strategy. In early November, Darnell told me he wanted to talk about the future. We were at the kitchen table a Sunday morning late enough that the light came in sideways through the plantation shutters and made long lines across the floor. He had his coffee. I had mine. He put his cup down and laced his fingers together on the table, that gesture I had watched 10,000 times, the gesture of a man organizing what he was about to say, and he said, "I've been doing a lot of thinking about where we are, about what I want." I said, "Tell me." He said he had been thinking about the contracting business, about restructuring it, about some changes he wanted to make to how the assets were held for tax purposes, he said, for efficiency. He used the word consolidate. He mentioned Camille's name for the first time in 14 years, briefly, almost casually, as someone who had some experience in asset restructuring from her legal work, and had offered some general advice. I listened to every word. I said, "That sounds like something worth thinking through carefully." He looked at me with something in his eyes I couldn't immediately name. Relief, maybe, or the specific gratitude of a man who has been expecting resistance and found none. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. He said, "I knew you'd understand. You always understand." I turned my hand over and held his for a moment. His palm was warm. The calluses were still there from 30 years of construction work, the same calluses that had been there the night we ate cold chicken on a linoleum floor and called it a celebration. I said, I just want what's best for us. That was true. I had simply revised my definition of us. 3 days later, Patricia Huang sent me a document to review. Everything was in order. The sequence my father had built was complete. The building at 1142 Commerce Drive had been formally placed into a limited liability company registered solely in my name, which had been established 6 weeks prior. The marital estate and the separate estate were now two clean, distinct, legally documented things. Darnell believed he was preparing to restructure everything he had. He did not know that I had already quietly removed the most valuable piece from the board. He did not know that my father had placed it there for exactly this moment. And he did not know that in 11 days he was going to ask me to sit in a room and watch him sign documents with a pen I'd given him on our 10th anniversary. And that I was going to say yes. Because the only thing more powerful than walking away is knowing exactly what you're walking away from and exactly what you're walking away with. I said yes. Darnell told me he wanted a divorce on a Wednesday, not a Sunday, not a Friday night, when the week was ending and there was time to absorb it. A Wednesday. He came home from what he said was a meeting with his accountant. I did not ask which accountant because Patricia Huang had already told me to stop asking questions I didn't need the answers to yet. And he sat down across from me at the kitchen table in the same chair he always sat in, and put both hands flat on the surface and said, "Savannah, I need to be honest with you about something." I put down the pen I was grading with. I folded my hands in my lap. I looked at him. He said he had been doing a lot of soul searching. He said the illness had changed him, had made him examine what he truly wanted from the time he had left. He said he had feelings he hadn't been able to suppress, feelings that had resurfaced during the hardest months, and that it wouldn't be fair to me or to himself to pretend otherwise. He said her name once quietly, like a confession he had rehearsed. He said he was sorry. He was sorry. I thought about the East Point house with the cracked driveway. I thought about the duplex on Campbellton Road and Mr. Greer who paid on the first. I thought about 11 months of 4-hour nights and hospital parking lots and cashier's checks and smothered chicken and the particular smell of a hospital room that gets into your clothes and stays there. I thought about the Mont Blanc pen sitting in the drawer of his nightstand engraved with his initials and the date of our 10th anniversary that I had saved 4 months to buy. I said, "Thank you for telling me." He blinked. He had been bracing for something else. I could see it, the specific physical preparation of a man who expects an explosion and has tensed every muscle in anticipation of it. My stillness confused him. It moved through his body like a wrong note in a song he thought he knew. He said, "I don't want this to be ugly, Savannah. I want to be fair." I said, "I appreciate that." He said he had been thinking about how to divide things equitably. He said the Stonecrest house was the last remaining property, and he thought it was only right that I keep it, that it be transferred to me outright as part of the settlement. He called it the foundation for your next chapter. He said it with the particular warmth of a man who believes he is being generous, who has calculated his generosity against what he expects to gain, and found the math comfortable. I said, "That's very thoughtful of you." He exhaled. The tension left his shoulders in a slow release, the relief of a man who has said the terrible thing, and found the ground still solid beneath him. He reached across the table and touched my hand briefly, not holding it, just touching it, the gesture of a man who wants to be kind, but has already emotionally vacated the room, and said, "I knew you'd be reasonable. You've always been the reasonable one." I did not tell him what I knew. I did not tell him about Patricia Huang or Raymond Osei or 1142 Commerce Drive. I did not tell him about the LLC or the sequence or the document that had been signed and filed 6 weeks prior. I did not tell him that the Stonecrest house, generous as the gesture was, represented the smallest piece of what was actually in play. I said, I think we should let the attorneys handle the details. That way it's clean. He nodded. He said that was mature. He said he was glad we could do this like adults. He said, I always knew whatever happened, we'd be able to talk. He said this with the confidence of a man who has mistaken a woman's silence for agreement for so long that he no longer knows the difference. I went to bed at 10. I lay in the dark and listened to him moving around downstairs, the refrigerator opening the television low, the sound of his boots on the hardwood floor that had absorbed 14 years of us, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not grief, not rage. Something quieter and more precise than either. The feeling of a woman who has been carrying a structure on her back for so long that when it is finally lifted, she does not feel lighter, she feels the exact shape of what she was carrying outlined in the space where it used to be. I slept 6 hours, the most I'd slept since March. The weeks that followed had a particular texture. Darnell moved through the house with the careful politeness of a guest, considerate, slightly distant, performing decency in the way people do when they are managing their own guilt by being pleasant to its source. He made coffee in the mornings and left a cup for me without being asked. He asked about my students. He did not mention Camille again after that first night, as though naming her once had been sufficient, and further naming would make something too real that he preferred to keep at a comfortable distance. He also, I noticed, began spending more time on his phone in the evenings. Not secretively, he had moved past the phase of hiding it, but openly, the phone flat on his knee, while we watched television, the screen angled in a way that communicated he was no longer concerned about what I saw. That had a name too, that particular behavior. Patricia called it the transition to the next phase. I called it a man who had already left the building and was just waiting for his forwarding address to be confirmed. It was during one of those evenings, a Tuesday second week of November, the television on, and both of us separately present in the same room, that he said almost casually that his attorney had drafted the settlement paperwork and that there would be a meeting at the law office to finalize things. He said it would be straightforward. He said he wanted me there. I said, of course. He said, Camille will be there too, as she has an interest in some of the business assets we're restructuring. There it was. Not hidden anymore. Just placed on the table between us like a document that had already been signed in another room. I had said, that's fine. He looked at me for a long moment. I looked back. I had learned over these weeks to hold his gaze without the expression that used to live there, the expression of a woman hoping to find something in a man's eyes that would make the story come out differently. That expression was gone. What I had now was simpler and more durable. The look of a woman who has read every page. He said, "You're handling this really well, Savannah." I said, "I'm doing my best." He meant it as a compliment. I accepted it as information. The call that changed the texture of everything came on a Friday evening 10 days before the scheduled meeting. I was in the kitchen when my phone rang, a number I didn't recognize, a 404 area code. I almost didn't answer. I answered. The voice on the other end was a woman I had never spoken to, but recognized immediately. Not her voice, which I had never heard, but the quality of it. Controlled, legal, precise. She introduced herself as Camille Reeves. She said she hoped I didn't mind her calling directly. She said she wanted to make sure I understood what was being proposed before the meeting, so there were no surprises. She said it in the tone of someone extending a courtesy that is actually an assessment, trying to measure how much I knew, how much I felt, how much of a problem I was going to be. I said, "I appreciate you calling." She said the restructuring involved several of the business assets Darnell held, and that the intent was to consolidate them under a new entity in which she would have a primary interest. She said Darnell had been very clear about wanting the process to be transparent. She used the word transparent the way people use it when they want credit for honesty they are performing rather than practicing. She said, "I just want you to know that Darnell has spoken very highly of you, of everything you've done for him." I stood in my kitchen in the house I was supposedly being given as a consolation. and listened to the woman who had walked into a hospital with $47 sunflowers tell me that my husband had spoken highly of me. I said, "That's kind of him." She said, "I hope we can make this as smooth as possible for everyone." I said, "I have every intention of making this smooth." There was a brief silence. She was, I think, expecting something different. Tears, maybe. Anger. The kind of ragged edge that would tell her she had the measure of me. She did not get it. What she got was the voice of a woman who had been meeting with an attorney every Thursday for 6 weeks, and whose father had placed a $2.3 million building in her name in 2018, and who had spent the last month being called reasonable by a man who did not know the difference between a woman who had given up and a woman who had simply finished preparing. I said, "I'll see you at the meeting, Camille." I hung up. I stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then I picked up my phone and called Patricia Huang. She answered on the second ring. I said, "They're going to try to move everything into a new entity at the meeting." She said, "I know. I received the draft documents this afternoon." I said, "Are we ready?" She said, "Savannah, we have been ready for 5 weeks." I made dinner that night. Smothered chicken again, because some habits belong to you, regardless of what is happening around them. I set the table with the good placemats. I called Darnell when it was ready. And he came downstairs and sat across from me and ate 2 full plates and said it was the best thing he'd had all week. I watched him eat and thought about my father's hands on a transfer document in 2018. And a 71-year-old man in a brown suit who had been holding a sequence in a manila folder for 6 years. And a woman named Patricia Huang who had drawn a line on a yellow legal pad that I had looked at for a long time. I had entered this marriage with nothing but intention and discipline, and the belief that those 2 things sustained long enough could build something that would hold. I had not been wrong about the building. I had just been wrong about who I was building it with. 10 days. The law office was on the 14th floor of a building on West Peachtree Street, with a lobby that smelled like recycled air and ambition. Patricia Huang met me in the parking garage at 9:45 a.m. She was wearing a charcoal blazer and carrying a slim leather portfolio. And she looked at me the way she always looked at me, with the particular assessment of a woman who needs to know that the person beside her is going to hold steady when the room gets difficult. I was wearing the black cashmere turtleneck I had bought 3 years ago for a parent-teacher conference at a school where the principal made everyone feel like they were being evaluated. I had learned that day that the right clothes are not about vanity. They are about what you need to feel like yourself when the room is trying to make you into something smaller. She said, "Wayne, how are you?" I said, "Ready." She said, "Good. Remember, you are there as a witness to the dissolution proceedings. You are not there to negotiate. You are not there to react. You are there to sign where I point and to let everything else happen the way it is going to happen." I said, "I understand." She said, "One more thing. Whatever you see in that room, whatever he does, whatever she does, your face stays the same." I said, "Patricia, I have been keeping my face the same for 2 months." She almost smiled. It was the closest I had seen her come to it. She said, "Then today will be easy." The conference room was large and deliberately neutral, the kind of room designed to make large transactions feel administrative, to drain the human content out of decisions that will restructure people's lives. A long glass table, high-backed chairs in a gray fabric, a credenza with a water pitcher and glasses that no one would touch. The kind of room where documents become more real than people. Darnell was already there when we entered. He was wearing the charcoal suit he wore to closings, the one with the faint chalk stripe, the one I'd taken to the dry cleaner on Covington Highway so many times. The ticket stub was still in the pocket of my winter coat. He stood when we came in, a reflex of politeness so ingrained it survived even this, and nodded at Patricia and looked at me with an expression I had seen before on men who have caused damage and want the person they damaged to make it comfortable for them. He said, "Savannah, you look good." I said, "Thank you, Darnell." Camille was seated already on Darnell's side of the table in a chair positioned close enough to his that the message was architectural. She was wearing a structured ivory blazer, and her bone-straight hair was pulled back, which made her face sharper, more prepared. She looked at me once when I entered a brief measuring look, the same assessment as the phone call, and then looked at the documents in front of her. She did not stand. She did not speak to me directly. Darnell's attorney was a man named Philip Garrett, mid-50s, silver-haired with the specific confidence of someone who bills $400 an hour and wants you to know it without saying it. He managed the room efficiently, distributing documents, narrating the structure of the proceedings, explaining what each signature would formalize. He had the polished neutrality of a man who has orchestrated enough of these rooms to have stopped feeling anything in them. Patricia sat beside me and said nothing. She had reviewed every document. She knew every number. She let Philip Garrett narrate, and she listened with her pen resting on the table and her reading glasses on. And she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who was not surprised by anything in the room. The first set of documents was the formal dissolution agreement. The Stonecrest house transferred to me. The joint accounts divided according to a formula that I had reviewed with Patricia and found acceptable given the full picture, the picture Darnell's attorney did not have. I signed where Patricia pointed. My signature was steady. It had been steady for 51 days. The second set of documents was what Darnell's attorney called the business restructuring. This was the architecture Camille had outlined on the phone, the consolidation of Darnell's contracting business assets into a new LLC in which she would hold a primary interest. There were 6 documents. The language was dense and specific. Philip Garrett narrated each one in the practiced shorthand of a man who has said these words many times. I watched Darnell's face while he signed. He signed with the Mont Blanc. I had not known he would bring it, had not thought about the pen since I named it in part 1. In the telling of this story, and when he uncapped it, I felt something move through my chest that was not grief and not anger, but something closer to the specific sadness of a detail that lands exactly right. The engraving caught the light from the window for a moment. DW, June 14th, 2010. 4 months of saving. A woman who believed a man's hands deserved something beautiful. He signed all 6 documents. Camille signed beside him on 5 of them. Her signature was angular and decisive, the signature of a woman who had wanted this outcome for a long time and was finally watching it arrive. Philip Garrett gathered the documents and squared them on the table and said, "I believe that completes the business restructuring. We'll have the filings processed by end of week." Camille exhaled. It was barely audible, a small controlled release of something she had been holding. She uncrossed and recrossed her legs. She touched the documents in front of her with one finger briefly, the way people touch things they have just acquired. Patricia Huang said, "Before we close, I have a brief matter to address." Philip Garrett looked at her. Darnell looked at her. Camille's hand stilled on the documents. Patricia opened her portfolio and removed 3 sets of papers clipped separately and placed 1 set in front of Philip Garrett, 1 set in front of Darnell, and set 1 in front of herself. She did not place 1 in front of Camille. She did not look at Camille when she spoke. She said, "Pursuant to Georgia Code and the relevant provisions of separate property law, I'd like to enter into the record the following documentation regarding an asset that falls outside the marital estate and therefore outside the scope of today's restructuring proceedings." Philip Garrett was already reading. His expression did not change, but his reading slowed the specific deceleration of a man who has encountered something he did not know was coming and is processing it line by line. Patricia said, "The property at 1142 Commerce Drive, Decatur, Georgia, was transferred as a documented separate gift to my client, Savannah Marie Webb, on March 14, 2018, predating any marital dispute by more than 6 years. It has been held continuously in her name, and as of October the 31st of this year, has been formally placed into a limited liability company registered solely in her name. Designated Webb Heritage Properties, LLC. She said, "The assessed value of this asset as of the most recent county appraisal is $2.3 million. She said, "None. This asset was never part of the marital estate. It is not subject to equitable distribution. It is not affected by today's proceedings in any way." The room was quiet. Not the administrative quiet of documents being signed. A different kind of quiet. The kind that follows a sound that everyone in the room heard, but no one was prepared for. Darnell had stopped looking at the papers in front of him. He was looking at me. His expression had the specific quality of a man encountering a version of events that does not match the map he has been navigating, by a man standing in a place that looks familiar but is suddenly oriented differently than it was a moment ago. Camille was reading the documents Patricia had placed in front of Philip Garrett. Her angular face was very still. The ivory blazer did not move. Only her eyes moved left to right, line by line, with the trained efficiency of a woman who reads contracts for a living and understands word by word exactly what she is reading. Philip Garrett set the papers down. He looked at Darnell. He said in a measured professional tone that barely covered the subtext, "Were you aware of this property?" Darnell said one toned, "No." One word, flat and airless. The word of a man whose architecture has just shifted under him and who does not yet know how far the ground has moved. Patricia said, "There's one additional item." She removed a single page from the portfolio and placed it in front of Philip Garrett. She said, "Several of the business assets included in today's restructuring, specifically the equipment financing lines and the bonding capacity registered under Darnell Webb Contracting LLC, were underwritten using a credit guarantee that traces back to a joint financial instrument my client and Mr. Webb established in 2017. That instrument was formally dissolved as of November 4th of this year, upon my client's written request, which he was fully entitled to make as a co-signatory." She said, "The bonding capacity, as currently structured, is no longer active." Camille looked up from the documents. Patricia looked at her then for the first time since we had entered the room, and said with the same even professional tone she had used for everything else, "The assets Mr. Webb has just transferred carry certain operational dependencies that may no longer be in place. Your counsel will want to review the specifics before the filings are processed." Camille looked at Darnell. Darnell looked at his attorney. Philip Garrett looked at the papers in front of him with the expression of a man doing math he does not like the outcome of. I looked at the window. The trees along West Peachtree Street were bare, now the last of the October color gone. Just the clean gray lines of branches against a November sky. I had always liked Atlanta in November. There was something honest about the trees when they had let everything go. Patricia closed her portfolio. She said, "I believe that completes our portion of the proceedings." She looked at me. I picked up my copy of the documents and put them in my bag and stood. I smoothed the front of the black cashmere turtleneck. I looked at Darnell one last time at his hands flat on the glass table, the Mont Blanc pen still uncapped beside them, D.W. June 14th, 2010. Catching the light from the window, and I felt nothing that needed to be said out loud. My father had told Raymond Osei, make sure she has something they cannot reach. He had built the door. Patricia had opened it. And I had walked through it in a room on the 14th floor of a building on West Peachtree Street, while a man who used my pen to sign away everything I had sold 3 houses to save sat across a glass table and finally understood what he had actually signed. I said, "Have a good day, Philip." I did not say anything to Darnell. I did not say anything to Camille. I walked out of the conference room with Patricia Huang beside me, and the door closed behind us with the soft, pressurized click of a room that has been sealed from the outside, and I pressed the elevator button and watched the numbers descend and thought about a cracked driveway in East Point and cold chicken on linoleum, and a man spinning me once in an empty room, and the sound of his boots on hardwood echoing all the way to the back bedroom. I thought about all of it, and then the elevator opened, and I stepped inside, and the doors closed, and I watched the lobby rise to meet me, and I let it go. The call came at 9:14 the next morning. I was in the kitchen with my second cup of coffee, and the essays I'd been too distracted to finish grading the night before. The red pen was in my hand. The papers were spread across the table in the particular organized disorder of a teacher who grades the way she thinks, circling, annotating, leaving questions in the margins for students to find. It was a Thursday. The light through the plantation shutters was thin and white, the specific quality of November light in Atlanta that makes everything look like it has been cleaned overnight. My phone was face up on the table. I saw the number before it rang twice. Camille's attorney. Not Philip Garrett, a different name, one I didn't recognize with a 678 area code. I let it go to voicemail. I finished grading the paragraph I was on. Then I picked up the phone and listened. The message was 4 minutes and 22 seconds long, professional, measured with the particular tension of a legal voice trying to maintain its register while delivering information that does not stay inside professional registers. He said there were concerns about the asset transfer completed the previous day. He said his client had discovered certain, he paused on the word, a brief loaded pause, operational dependencies that had not been disclosed in the restructuring documents. He said his client would appreciate a call at my earliest convenience to discuss a path forward. A path forward. I set the phone down. I picked up the red pen. I finished grading the next essay, which was about the water cycle written by a 10-year-old named Deshawn, who had a gift for metaphor that I had been quietly encouraging for 2 years. I wrote, "Your comparison of evaporation to starting over is one of the best things I've read this week." Then I stacked the papers and poured the rest of my coffee down the drain and called Patricia Huang. She had already received a copy of the same communication from opposing counsel. She had been expecting it since approximately 9:07 a.m., she said, which was when Camille's firm had opened for business. She said, "Let them reach out. We don't call back today. We let them sit with it." I said, "How long?" She said, 48 hours. Long enough for them to understand the full scope of the situation. Short enough that nothing hardens into a formal dispute we'd rather resolve informally. I said, "And what is the full scope?" She said, "The bonding capacity is the most immediate problem. Without active bonding, the contracting business cannot bid on any project over a certain value threshold." The 3 jobs Darnell had in the pipeline for Q1, the Decatur kitchen remodel, a commercial renovation in Sandy Springs, and a school district maintenance contract, all require active bonding. Those contracts are now in jeopardy. She paused. She said, "The equipment financing lines are the second problem. 2 of the pieces of heavy equipment were financed through instruments that your credit profile supported. When those instruments were dissolved, the lenders have the right to reassess the financing terms. I expect they'll be hearing from at least one lender by end of week." I sat with that. I said, "He didn't know any of this when he signed." Patricia said, "No. And Camille's attorneys didn't know either, which is why they're calling the morning after, instead of flagging it at the table. They did their due diligence on the assets as they appeared on paper. They did not anticipate that the structural support underneath those assets had a separate name on it." I said, "My name." She said, "Your name." What followed in the next 72 hours was not dramatic in the way that the conference room had been dramatic. It was quieter and more thorough. The kind of unraveling that happens not in a single moment, but in a series of phone calls and emails and conversations that each carry a piece of information that accumulated tell a story no one wants to be in. I learned most of it secondhand through Patricia and through Renee, who had her own sources in the Atlanta professional community, and who texted me updates with the specific restraint of a woman who understood that information was being shared for my awareness, not my entertainment. By Friday afternoon, one of the equipment lenders had contacted Darnell's business manager about the change in the credit guarantee structure. The conversation had not gone well. By Saturday morning, word had reached the project manager at the Sandy Springs commercial renovation that there might be a bonding issue with the contractor. The project manager had placed a call to his client. The client had placed a call to Philip Garrett. By Sunday, the school district maintenance contract, the largest of the 3 pipeline jobs, a $380,000 annual agreement that Darnell had been building toward for 2 years, had been placed on administrative hold, pending verification of bonding status. Renee called me Sunday evening. She said, "Pastor Williams called Darnell this afternoon." I said, "About what?" She said, "About what he did to you." Someone told someone at First Emmanuel. I don't know who. You know how that congregation moves. I did know. First Emmanuel Baptist on Cascade Road had been our church for 11 years. It was the kind of congregation where people knew the difference between a couple who was struggling and a couple where one person had done something, and they did not pretend otherwise. Darnell's mother was a deaconess. His aunt taught Sunday school. His crew foreman and his crew foreman's wife sat 3 rows behind us every second and fourth Sunday. I said, "What did Pastor Williams say?" Renee was quiet for a moment. She said, "He said he'd be praying for everyone involved. But he said it in that way he has, the way where the praying is not the actual message." I knew the way. The actual message was that Pastor Williams, who had officiated our wedding and baptized our niece and shaken Darnell's hand at every church anniversary dinner for 11 years, had made a call. And, in the specific social architecture of a black middle-class Atlanta church community, a call from the pastor is not a private conversation. It is a positioning. It is a community deciding collectively where it stands. I did not engineer that. I want to be clear about that. I had not called anyone at First Emmanuel. I had not told anyone what happened in the conference room on the 14th floor. Information moves through the structures it moves through, and sometimes those structures are doing their own accounting of people's behavior, and finding the numbers don't add up. What I had done was exist for 14 years in a community that knew me, that knew the houses I had sold, that knew what kind of woman shows up to hospital appointments with a yellow legal pad, that knew what it meant when that woman's husband started bringing Zaxby's home as though lunch could absorb the debt he was accumulating. Communities know things before they say them. They had known this for a while. The conference room had just given them a date to organize the knowing around. Darnell called me on Sunday night. I was in the living room of the Stonecrest house, my house now legally, the ink dry with a book I hadn't been reading, and the television low in the background. His name on the screen looked strange to me. Familiar and strange at the same time, the way a word looks wrong if you stare at it too long. I answered. He said, "Savannah." I said, "Darnell." There was a pause. The particular pause of a man who has prepared what he wants to say and is now uncertain whether the preparation is adequate. He said, "I didn't know about the building." I said, "I know." He said, "My father-in-law, your father, I didn't know he had done that." I said, "Neither did I." For a long time. Another pause. I could hear him breathing. The same steady breath I had listened to in the dark for 14 years lying still beside him while I thought with the clarity that comes at 4 a.m. when the comfortable explanations are gone. He said, "The bonding, the Sandy Springs job, the school district contract." I said, "Yes." He said, "Savannah, those are my crew's jobs. Those are people's livelihoods." I let that sit in the air between us for a moment. I thought about the 11 months I had spent making sure his crew's livelihoods were protected. The duplex I had sold specifically so his business expenses wouldn't lapse, and his crew wouldn't lose their paychecks while he was in the hospital. The specific, unglamorous, unwitnessed labor of a woman who had held everything together, because that was what she had promised to do. And she did not break promises, even when the person she had promised was on the phone at 11:47 p.m. with someone else. I said, "I know whose jobs they are, Darnell." He said, "Is there anything?" He stopped, started again. "Is there a way to—" I said, "You should talk to your attorney about what options are available. That's not a conversation I'm the right person to have." He said, "Savannah." I said, "Get some rest, Darnell." I hung up. I sat in the living room for a while after that. The house was very quiet, in the way that houses become when they have absorbed a long period of tension, and the tension has finally resolved into something not peace exactly, but the absence of performance. I was no longer performing anything in this house. I was just in it. I thought about his crew. Marcus, who had worked for Darnell since 2012 and had a daughter starting community college in January. Jerome, who had just put a down payment on a house in Morrow. The younger guys, the apprentices who were learning a trade from a man who had once known how to build things that held. I was not responsible for what Darnell had done to his business by choosing to restructure it through a woman whose attorneys hadn't checked the foundations. I was not responsible for the credit guarantee he hadn't known existed until it was dissolved. I was not responsible for the sequence my father had built before either of us understood it would be needed. But I thought about Marcus's daughter starting college. I thought about Jerome's house in Morrow. I picked up the phone and sent Patricia Huang a text. "I want to talk about the bonding situation on Monday, not to restore it. To discuss whether there's a limited structured option that protects the crew without restoring Darnell's full access. Call me when you can," she responded in 4 minutes, already thinking about this. Monday, 10 a.m. I set the phone down. I had not forgiven Darnell. I was not close to forgiving Darnell. Forgiveness is its own sequence, and I had not yet had the time to begin it. But there is a difference between what a man deserves and what the people around him deserve, and I had been making that distinction my whole life, and I was not going to stop making it now, because I was angry. My father had not built me a weapon. He had built me a door. The distinction mattered. I turned off the television. I turned off the lights. I walked through the house that was mine now, past the kitchen, where I had made smothered chicken and set the table with the good placemats, and watched a man eat 2 full plates and tell me it was the best thing he'd had all week. And I went upstairs and got into bed and pulled the covers up and lay in the dark of my own house and felt the specific silence of a life that had just changed its shape. Tomorrow was Monday. I had a list. The Monday meeting with Patricia lasted 2 hours. She arrived at 10 with coffee she had stopped for on the way. 2 cups, no sugar the way she had learned. I took it somewhere in the weeks of Thursday mornings. And she sat across from me at the kitchen table in the Stonecrest house and opened her portfolio, and we talked, not about strategy this time, about outcomes, about the difference between what the law allowed and what I could live with, which are not always the same geography and which require a different kind of navigation. I told her what I wanted. I wanted a limited bonding instrument narrow in scope tied specifically to active crew payroll and existing project completion. Not to new business development, not to anything that would reconstitute Darnell's business capacity in a way that benefited Camille's newly acquired interests. I wanted it structured with a sunset clause 90 days enough to complete the Q1 jobs in the pipeline and give the crew time to land elsewhere if the business ultimately couldn't sustain itself without the broader infrastructure that had been dissolved. Patricia listened. She wrote on the yellow legal pad. She said, "This is more generous than you are required to be." I said, I know. She said, it will be read by Darnell's attorneys as a potential opening. I said, then make the language clear enough that it isn't one. She said, that I can do. She made 3 calls from my kitchen table. Her voice in those calls had the same quality it always had measured, specific, leaving no interpretive space, and I refilled my coffee and graded 2 more essays while she worked. Because there is something clarifying about returning to ordinary tasks when the large things are in motion. Deshawn had turned in a second draft of the water cycle essay. He had expanded the evaporation metaphor into something that made me stop and read it twice. I wrote, "This is remarkable. Keep going." Patricia finished her calls and looked at her notes and said, "The instrument can be structured the way you've described. Philip Garrett will communicate it to Darnell's business manager by end of day. The crew should have clarity by Wednesday." I said, "Good," she said, "Savannah. What you're doing for those men, Marcus Jerome, the apprentice's Darnell, doesn't deserve for you to do this." I said, "No, he doesn't. But they didn't sell 3 houses. He did." She looked at me for a moment. Then she closed the portfolio. She said, "I'll have the documents to you by tomorrow morning." She left at noon. I sat at the kitchen table alone for a while after she went, in the particular quiet of a house that has stopped holding its breath. The essays were stacked. The coffee was gone. The light through the plantation shutters was the thin, white November light that made everything look clean. I thought about what came next. Not the legal mechanics, those were in Patricia's hands, and I trusted them there. I meant the other next, the life-shaped next. The question of what a woman does with the days after the sequence has completed, and the folder is closed, and the building on Commerce Drive is hers, and the house she is sitting in is hers, and the man she spent 14 years building something with is in an apartment somewhere in Buckhead with a woman whose attorney was on the phone with my attorney before the ink was dry. What do you do with the days after I called my sister in Charlotte? Her name is Lorraine, and she is 3 years younger than me, and she has always been the one who asks the question underneath the question. I told her the condensed version. She knew most of it already, the way sisters know things through the particular osmosis of decades. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "When are you coming to see me?" I said, "After Thanksgiving." She said, "Before Thanksgiving." I said, "Lorraine." She said, "Savannah Marie, you have not left Atlanta in 11 months. You have not seen your nephew since Easter. You sold 3 houses and sat in a conference room and watched a man use your pen to destroy himself, and then went home and made smothered chicken. Come to Charlotte. Come before Thanksgiving. Let someone take care of you for 5 minutes." I was quiet. She said, "Daddy would have already booked your flight by now." That was the thing about Lorraine. She always knew which sentence would land. I booked the flight that afternoon. 3 days in Charlotte, arriving that Friday. I packed a bag that evening, not much, just enough. And I moved through the Stonecrest house doing the ordinary end-of-day things. And somewhere around 7 o'clock, I became aware that the specific weight I'd been carrying since March had shifted. Not lifted, it was still there. The grief of it, the loss of it, the 14 years of it, but shifted. Distributed differently across the body. The way weight changes when you finally set something down and realize you've been compensating for it so long, you'd forgotten what your natural posture felt like. The domino that fell first was the Sandy Springs project. I learned about it from Renee on Tuesday evening. The client on the Sandy Springs commercial renovation, a boutique fitness company expanding their footprint in the metro area, had done their own research after the bonding question arose. What they found through the normal channels of a client who is suddenly uncertain about their contractor was that the entity now holding the business assets was a newly formed LLC with no operational history, no independent bonding, and a primary interest holder whose name did not appear anywhere in the project's original contracting documents. They had pulled out. It was a $290,000 job. The kind of job that anchors a quarter's revenue for a contracting operation of Darnell's size. The Decatur kitchen remodel held the clients were longtime contacts of Darnell's personally, people who had used him before and trusted the relationship over the paperwork, but the Sandy Springs loss had a weight that the Decatur job couldn't balance. Renee said Darnell's business manager had called Philip Garrett twice on Tuesday. She said the second call had lasted 40 minutes. The school district contract remained on administrative hold. The district's procurement office had a process for these situations, formal, documented, bureaucratic, and it would not move quickly in either direction. Darnell would be in that particular limbo for weeks. What I had not anticipated, and what Renee told me about on Wednesday morning with the careful voice she used when information was significant, was Camille. Camille Reeves had retained new counsel. Not a change in representation, an addition. A second firm, one that specialized in business litigation, brought in alongside her original attorney. Renee's source, who worked in a building 2 floors above Camille's firm in Buckhead, said the mood in the hallway had been notably different on Tuesday. She said Camille had arrived at 9 and left at 7, and the door to the corner conference room had been closed all day. I thought about the ivory blazer, the angular face, the finger touching the document she had just acquired. That brief, proprietary touch, the gesture of a woman watching something she had wanted for a long time finally arrive. I thought about what it must be like to watch it arrive, and then watch it immediately begin to reveal its conditions. I did not feel satisfaction about this in the way I might have expected. What I felt was something closer to the emotion you feel when a complicated piece of machinery finally does what it was built to do, not pleasure exactly, but the particular rightness of a mechanism functioning as designed. My father had designed this. Raymond Osei had held it. Patricia Huang had deployed it. I had simply had the steadiness to let it run. On Wednesday afternoon, Philip Garrett's office sent a formal communication to Patricia, acknowledging the limited bonding instrument I had proposed and requesting clarification on 2 procedural points. Patricia responded within the hour. The instrument was finalized by 4 o'clock. She sent me the confirmation with a single line. Marcus and Jerome will have their jobs through Q1. The rest is Darnell's to figure out. I read that line 3 times. I thought about Marcus's daughter starting college in January. I thought about Jerome's house in Morrow. I thought about the apprentices learning a trade from a man who had once known how to build things that held. And I thought, at least this part holds. At least this one thing holds. That evening I drove to First Emmanuel, not for a service. It was a Wednesday, and the Wednesday evening program had ended by the time I arrived. I parked in the lot and sat in the car and looked at the building for a while. Red brick white columns, the marquee out front, with the weak scripture in black removable letters. Proverbs 31:25. She is clothed with strength and dignity, and she laughs without fear of the future. I had sat under that scripture 11 years of Sundays. I had heard Pastor Williams preach it twice, that I remembered both times in the context of women in the congregation who had done something the community wanted to honor. I had never thought of it as particularly mine. I was a teacher. I graded papers and went to hospital appointments with yellow legal pads and made smothered chicken. Strength and dignity felt like categories that belonged to more visible women. I sat in the parking lot for a long time. I thought about my father reading contracts line by line in his office on Auburn Avenue. I thought about the specific precision of a man who watches other men's hands and notices things and says nothing until the right moment, and then does something quiet and permanent and completely outside the range of anyone's expectations. I thought about a sealed envelope with my name on it, held by a 71-year-old man in a brown suit for 6 years, waiting for the question his daughter would eventually ask. I thought he knew. Not that Darnell would do this specific thing, no father plans for that particular knowledge. But he knew the shape of the risk. He knew the way love sustained without structure leaves a woman architecturally exposed. He had spent his life in property. He knew what happened to buildings without foundations. He had built me a foundation in secret and told no one. That was the thing I kept coming back to, sitting in the parking lot of First Emmanuel on a Wednesday night in November with the marquee light making gold rectangles on the hood of my car. The secrecy of it. Not suspicious secrecy, the secrecy of a gift. The secrecy of a man who understood that some things only work if the person who needs them doesn't know they're there until the moment they need them. He had trusted me to ask the right question at the right time. I had. The cascade was not finished, I knew that. There would be more calls, more documents, more procedural machinery grinding through its paces. Camille's new litigation firm would find angles to pursue. Darnell would make decisions I couldn't predict, some of them possibly bad ones, because that was the nature of a man whose map had been wrong and who was now navigating without one. The school district contract might not come back. The business might not survive in its current form. Things that had been built over 14 years were going to continue coming apart in ways I could not fully control and had not fully caused. But the building on Commerce Drive was mine. The house I was sleeping in was mine. The limited instrument protecting Marcus and Jerome was filed and documented and clean. Patricia Huang's phone number was in my favorites, and my flight to Charlotte was booked for Friday morning, and my sister was already planning what she was going to cook. And my nephews had already sent me a voice message asking if I was going to sleep in the top bunk or the bottom bunk. And the answer I sent back was top bunk, always don't touch my bunk. I started the car. I pulled out of the First Emmanuel parking lot onto Cascade Road and headed toward Stonecrest. And the November city moved past the windows the way it always did. And the marquee lights shrank in the rearview mirror. And I thought about a woman clothed with strength and dignity, laughing without fear of the future. And I thought, I'm not laughing yet, but I can feel it coming. Charlotte in November is not Atlanta in November. Atlanta in November is bare trees and thin white light, and the specific melancholy of a city that doesn't quite know how to be cold. Charlotte does it differently, it commits. The cold comes in off the Piedmont with intention, and the sky goes the particular shade of gray that means it and the streets have a stillness in the early morning that Atlanta with its construction cranes and its perpetual motion never quite achieves. Lorraine picked me up from the airport in her Volvo with a thermos of coffee and a bag of cheese biscuits from a place she'd been going to since graduate school, and a look on her face that said she had been waiting 11 months for this specific pickup and was not going to waste it on small talk. She handed me the coffee. She drove. She let me be quiet for the first 20 minutes, which is one of the reasons I have loved my sister my entire life. Then she said, "Tell me the part you haven't told anyone yet." I looked out the window at the Charlotte streets, the bare trees, the early morning gray. I said, "I miss him." She didn't say anything. She just drove. I said, "Not the man who was on the phone at 11:47 p.m. Not the man in the conference room. The other one. The one who ate cold chicken on a linoleum floor and called it a celebration. I miss that man. And I don't know if that man ever existed outside of the version of him I was seeing, and I think that might be the hardest part, not knowing which one was real." Lorraine said, "Both of them were real. That's the part that's hard." I sat with that. She said, "Daddy used to say a man can be two true things at once. Most people are. The question isn't which one is real. The question is which one he chose to be when it mattered." I said, "He chose wrong." She said, "Yes, he did." We drove the rest of the way in a comfortable silence, and I ate 2 cheese biscuits, and drank the whole thermos of coffee, and by the time we pulled into her driveway in the Noda neighborhood, felt for the first time in 11 months like a woman on a visit rather than a woman in a crisis. My nephews were 9 and 12, Marcus Jr. and Theodore, who went by Theo and had recently decided that nicknames were beneath him, and was now insisting on Theodore with the specific dignity of a 12-year-old who has just discovered that he has opinions. They were both at school when we arrived, but Theo had left a handwritten note on the kitchen counter that said, "Aunt Savannah, top bunk, is made up. Don't let Marcus Jr. touch your stuff. He will." I kept that note. I folded it and put it in my coat pocket, and it stayed there the entire weekend. Lorraine's husband, David, was a high school history teacher with a talent for making large meals appear without apparent effort, and a policy of not asking questions that weren't his to ask. He shook my hand when I arrived, said he was glad I was there, and put a plate of food in front of me within 20 minutes that I ate completely without registering what it was. He refilled the plate without comment. I ate that too. I slept 9 hours the first night, not the managed sleep of a woman rationing her rest against the length of her list. Full, uninterrupted sleep in the top bunk of my nephew's room with a comforter that smelled like laundry detergent and a small glow-in-the-dark solar system on the ceiling that Lorraine had put up for Marcus Jr. when he went through his astronomy phase in 2nd grade. I lay in the dark and looked at the glow-in-the-dark planets and thought about nothing in particular, which was the first time in 11 months I had thought about nothing in particular. And it was the most extravagant thing I had done all year. The news from Atlanta arrived in pieces over the weekend, the way news does when you have stepped slightly outside the radius of your own life. Renee texted Saturday morning, "Philip Garrett withdrew from representing Darnell. Heard it from his paralegal's cousin. Something about non-payment of retainer." I read that and set the phone down and went downstairs where Lorraine was making waffles and helped her without discussing it. Patricia emailed Saturday afternoon Camille's litigation firm filed a preliminary inquiry into the asset transfer documentation Friday. "Routine expected, no action required from you. I'll handle. Enjoy your weekend." I appreciated that last sentence more than I could adequately express. I wrote back, "Thank you, I am." The third piece came Sunday morning from a number I didn't immediately recognize. A 404 number, Atlanta someone, not in my contacts. I let it go to voicemail. The message was 40 seconds long. It was Darnell's mother. Miss Eunice Webb had been a deaconess at First Emmanuel for 31 years. She was 73 years old and 5 feet 2 inches tall, and she had a voice that had always reminded me of a church organ, full and resonant, and capable of filling a space much larger than the one it was in. She had called me Savannah baby since the second time we met, and had never once stopped even through the diagnosis and the hospital months and all of it. Her voicemail said, "Savannah baby, it's Eunice. I know you're out of town, and I'm not calling to put anything on you. I just want you to know that I know what my son did. I know what you gave up for him. And I know what kind of woman you are, because I've watched you for 14 years. And a woman does not lie about who she is for that long. I am not asking you for anything. I'm not asking you to forgive him or talk to him or make anything easier for him. I'm just calling to say, I see you. I've always seen you. And I'm sorry my son didn't see you the same way, that's all. You don't need to call me back." I sat in the top bunk of my nephew's room on a Sunday morning in Charlotte and listened to that message twice and cried in a way I had not cried since Raymond Osei's office. Not the careful, managed release of a woman who has a list to get back to, but the full, ungoverned kind. The kind that comes when someone says a true thing in the exact right way at the exact right moment. Theo knocked on the door 20 minutes later. He opened it a crack and looked at me with the specific, uncomfortable concern of a 12-year-old boy encountering a crying adult and said, "Aunt Savannah, are you okay?" I wiped my face. I said, "I'm okay, Theodore. I'm just having a feeling." He considered this seriously. Then he said, "Do you want to play chess? It helps me when I'm having a feeling." I said, "I would love to play chess." He beat me in 11 moves. He was gracious about it in the way that children are gracious when they have clearly been taught that winning without humility is its own kind of loss. He said, "Do you want to go again? I'll spot you a bishop." I said, "Set them up." He beat me again in 14 moves. I didn't mind. There was something deeply ordinary and deeply necessary about sitting across a chessboard from a 12-year-old who called himself Theodore and took the game seriously and offered me a bishop out of the generosity of someone who understood that the point was not to win quickly, but to play long enough for the other person to find their footing. I thought about that on the flight back to Atlanta Monday afternoon, about the point not being to win quickly, about playing long enough for the other person to find their footing. I thought about Marcus and Jerome and the apprentices and the 90-day instrument Patricia had filed, and the way I had structured it, not to restore, but to give enough time for people to find their footing. My father had given me time. 6 years of a sealed envelope waiting in Raymond Osei's office. Time for me to build a life, to love a man, to sell the houses, to sit in the parking lots, to finally ask the question he had been waiting for me to ask. He had not intervened when Darnell was making choices that would eventually require intervention. He had trusted me to reach the moment of asking in my own time. That was the gift I understood on the plane looking out at the November clouds between Charlotte and Atlanta. Not the building, not the $2.3 million, not the LLC or the separate estate or the legal architecture Patricia had deployed with such precision. The gift was the time. The gift was being trusted to get there. The plane descended into Hartsfield-Jackson, and the Atlanta sprawl appeared below the highways and the neighborhoods and the construction cranes and the bare November trees. And somewhere in Decatur, a 2-story building on Commerce Drive with a dental practice on one floor and an accounting firm on the other, and my name on the deed, and I thought, I am home, not the home I left in March, when everything was still the shape I thought it was. A different home. Smaller in some ways, larger in others. A home that was entirely mine without the particular negotiation of shared space and shared assumption that marriage requires the constant low-level adjustment of 2 people trying to occupy the same life without losing themselves in it. I had lost myself in it anyway. Slowly, incrementally, in the way that dedicated people lose themselves not through negligence, but through the sustained priority of someone else's needs over the accumulation of their own. I had been so focused on holding the structure together that I had stopped asking whether the structure was worth holding. The answer I now knew was partial. Some of it had been worth holding. The 14 years of cold chicken and yellow legal pads and smothered chicken in hospital parking lots had not been worthless. They had been real, and real things have weight regardless of how they end. But the version of me that had sustained all of it deserved more than a consolation house and the reputation of being the reasonable one. She deserved the building on Commerce Drive. She deserved the top bunk in her nephew's room and 9 hours of sleep and 2 losses at chess against a 12-year-old who called himself Theodore and spotted her a bishop out of kindness. She deserved the Monday afternoon flight home with the clouds below her and the city rising up to meet her. And the particular feeling of a woman who has completed something difficult and is for the first time in a long time only carrying her own weight. I texted Renee from the taxi landing. "Home in 30. How's everything?" She responded in 2 minutes. "The school district contract came through official channels today. They're opening the bid to new contractors. One of the firms submitting is run by a woman named Carla Hutchins. She's been trying to break into district contracts for 2 years. She's very good." I read that twice. Then I typed, "Send me her information." Renee sent it in 30 seconds, which meant she had been waiting for me to ask. I put my phone in my bag and looked out the taxi window at the Atlanta that was mine. The highways, the trees, the cranes, the particular angle of late afternoon light on November glass. And I thought about Carla Hutchins, submitting a bid she had been working toward for 2 years, and about the school district contract that was now open, and about the building on Commerce Drive with 2 good tenants and solid bones, and my name on the deed. I thought about what it meant to build something that holds. And then the taxi pulled off the highway and onto surface streets, and the Stonecrest neighborhood rose around me, familiar and changed, and I thought tomorrow. Tomorrow the next thing. I drove to 1142 Commerce Drive on a Tuesday morning in December. Not for a meeting. Not for a legal reason. Not because Patricia had asked me to, or because Raymond Osei had scheduled something, or because there was a document requiring my signature. I drove there because it was mine, and I had never been inside it as its owner, and I thought it was time. The building sat on a corner lot in a part of Decatur that was neither glamorous nor neglected. The kind of block that had been quietly functional for decades, the kind that developers had begun not noticing in the last few years, without yet acting on, which meant the bones were still visible and the character was still intact. 2 stories red brick with wide windows on the second floor that would catch the morning light, and a parking lot along the south side that held maybe 20 cars. The dental practice occupied the ground floor Bright Smiles Family Dentistry, according to the sign on the door, with a logo of a tooth that had been designed sometime in the early 2000s and had not been updated since. The accounting firm on the second floor had a smaller sign, Okafor & Associates CPA, modest, solid, the kind of businesses that pay their rent on the first of the month because they understand what it means to be the kind of business that pays rent on the first of the month. I parked in the south lot and sat in the car for a moment. My father had stood here. I did not know how many times once to assess it, more than once to watch it, probably several times in 2018, when he was making the decision to move it into my name, while he still had the legal capacity and the time to do it cleanly. He had walked across this parking lot in his good shoes, the brown lace-ups he wore to every professional meeting. And he had looked at this building the way he looked at everything he invested in, with the patient attention of a man who understood that value is not always visible, and that what a thing will become is not always legible in what it currently is. He had looked at this building and thought of me. That was the part I kept returning to. Not the money, not the square footage, not the assessed value or the rental income, or the legal structure Patricia had built around it. The fact that my father, in the last year of his life, with his own time running short, had looked at a 2-story commercial building on a corner lot in Decatur and thought, this is what I want her to have when she needs something they cannot reach. I got out of the car. The morning was cold in the way December in Atlanta is cold, not severe, but honest, with a wind that came around the corner of the building and found the back of my neck. I was wearing the black cashmere turtleneck again. It had become, without my consciously deciding it, the thing I wore when I needed to feel like myself in a situation that was asking me to be something I'd never been before. I walked the perimeter of the building first. All 4 sides. The brickwork was sound. No significant cracking, no mortar deterioration that I could see from the ground. The windows on the second floor were original single pane, the kind that let in the cold and would eventually need replacing, but not urgently. The roof had been redone within the last several years. According to the documents Raymond had given me, a standing seam metal installation that would last 30 years with maintenance. My father had maintained it. Of course he had. I stood at the northwest corner and looked up at the second floor windows, catching the morning light the way I had imagined they would. And I thought about what Raymond Osei had said. Your father didn't just leave you a building. He left you a sequence. I understood now what a sequence was. Not a plan. A plan is rigid, breakable, dependent on conditions remaining stable. A sequence is different. A sequence is a series of prepared responses to conditions that have not yet occurred, organized by someone who has read enough of the world to know that the conditions will occur eventually, even if the exact shape is unknown. My father had been a sequencer his whole life. Every contract read line by line. Every property assessed not just for what it was, but for what it would need to be. Every man's hands watched in the light of what they revealed about his character. He had sequenced for me because he loved me, and because he was a precise man, and because precision applied to love produces protection. I walked to the front door. The dental practice didn't open until 9. It was 8:40. Through the glass I could see the waiting room, the chairs, the magazine rack, the reception desk with its frosted glass partition, the cheerful tooth logo on the wall. A normal Tuesday morning in a normal small business, the kind of ordinary that sustains itself quietly and reliably, and asks nothing of the world except to be allowed to continue. I had a key. Raymond Osei had given me a key at our first meeting in the same envelope as the deed documents. It was a standard commercial key brass on a ring with a small tag in my father's handwriting, 1142. The handwriting was his late handwriting, slower than it used to be, the pen pressing harder than it needed to, as though insisting on legibility. I had carried that key in my coat pocket since October. I had not used it. I put it in the lock. The lobby was small, a short corridor between the ground floor entrance and the dental practice's own interior door, with a stairwell to the right leading up to the second floor. The floor was tile neutral gray clean. The walls were painted the particular off-white of a space that has been maintained without being reimagined. There was a fire extinguisher in a wall cabinet and a building directory in a frame beside the stairwell. 2 tenants, both present, both paying, both steady. I stood in that corridor for a moment, then I walked up the stairs. The second floor hallway was longer than I expected, with the accounting firm at the far end, and 2 additional office suites between the stairwell and Okafor and Associates that were currently vacant. Raymond had mentioned the vacancies in our first meeting, not as a problem, he said, as an opportunity. The rental income from the 2 occupied units covered the building's carrying costs, with room left over. The vacant suites were simply space that had not yet found its right tenant. I walked to the end of the hallway and stood at the window that overlooked the corner of Commerce Drive and the street beyond. The December morning was visible through the glass, the bare trees, the cars moving at the measured pace of a neighborhood that does not rush the particular quality of light at 8:40 on a Tuesday in winter that makes everything look considered. I thought about what I wanted to put in those vacant suites. Not immediately. I was not a woman who made decisions before she had the information she needed. But I thought about it. About what belonged in a building like this, on a block like this, in a city that was changing in ways that were creating space for things that hadn't existed here before. I thought about Carla Hutchins, whose information Renee had sent me, who had been trying to break into school district contracts for 2 years and who was very good. I thought about whether a woman like that needed an office, and whether an office in a building like this, at a rate that made room for growth rather than extracting maximum return, was the kind of investment my father would have recognized. I thought it was. I took out my phone and stood at the window and called Raymond Osei. He answered on the second ring the way he always did. I said, "Raymond, I'm standing in the building." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How does it feel?" I looked out at the December street, the trees, the light, the particular stillness of a Tuesday morning that was asking nothing of me except to be present in it. I said, "It feels like something I should have found sooner." He said, "Your father would say you found it exactly when you were supposed to." I said, "That sounds like him." He said, "It does." I stood at that window for a while after we hung up, long enough for the dental practice to open below me. I heard the door, heard voices, heard the particular sound of a small business beginning its day. long enough for the morning light to shift as the sun cleared the tree line on the east side of Commerce Drive and came through the second-floor windows the way I'd known it would, filling the corridor with something that was not warmth exactly, but was adjacent to it. The particular quality of light in a good building on a cold morning that makes you understand why your father bought it. I thought about Miss Eunice's voicemail. I see you. I have always seen you. I thought about Theo spotting me a bishop and losing graciously and setting the pieces up again without being asked. I thought about Deshawn's evaporation metaphor and the note I'd written in the margin. This is remarkable. Keep going. I thought about Renee in a blanket on my back porch on the first cold night of fall asking me how I was actually doing. The Savannah version. I thought about my father's hands on a transfer document in March of 2018, slower than they used to be, pressing harder than necessary, insisting on legibility. I thought about cold chicken on linoleum, and a man spinning me once in an empty room, and boots on hardwood echoing all the way to the back bedroom, and I let myself feel the full weight of that loss, not as a wound, not as evidence of my own stupidity, not as a 14-year mistake to be corrected and moved past, but as something that had been real and had mattered and had now ended, and the ending did not erase the realness of it, and the realness of it did not require me to stay in something that was finished. It was real. It ended. Both things were true. I put the key back in my coat pocket. I walked back down the stairs. I crossed the lobby and pushed through the front door into the December morning and stood on the sidewalk in front of 1142 Commerce Drive with the cold wind coming around the corner and the sun on the brick and the sound of the city doing what it always did, moving building making itself into the next version of itself without waiting for permission. I took out my phone. I texted Patricia Huang. I'd like to schedule a meeting about the vacant suites. I have some ideas. She responded in 4 minutes. Thursday at 10. I typed Thursday at 10. Then I put the phone in my pocket and stood in front of my father's building, my building, for one more moment, the way you stand in front of something you have just claimed, not because you need to announce it, but because you want to feel the full dimension of it before you move on to the next thing. The dental practice window had a small plant on its sill, a pothos green and uncomplicated in a terracotta pot, growing in the direction of the light, the way plants do when no one is asking them to grow any other way. My father knew something about me I hadn't learned yet. I had learned it now. I walked back to my car. I had papers to grade, calls to return, a Thursday meeting to prepare for, and a life that was for the first time in a long time, organized entirely around its own architecture rather than someone else's. I drove back to Stonecrest in the December morning light and thought about what it meant to build something that holds not the bricks and the mortar, not the deed and the LLC, not the legal instruments and the signed documents and the sequence deployed in a conference room on the 14th floor. The thing that holds is the woman who was willing to be precise about what she was worth and patient about when to show it. The thing that holds is the door your father built before you knew you needed one. The thing that holds is the knowledge that the people who truly see you have always seen you, and that being seen by the right people is worth infinitely more than being chosen by the wrong ones. I had been chosen wrong once. I had been seen right my whole life. The difference between those two things was the distance between the woman who ate cold chicken on a linoleum floor, believing love was enough, and the woman driving back to her own house through the December streets of Atlanta, knowing that love without a foundation is just weather beautiful, sometimes devastating, sometimes and always, always temporary. A foundation lasts. Mine did. A lesson for anyone still holding the weight. If you have been the one who held everything together, the one who made the calls, signed the papers, sat in the parking lots, graded the papers, made the dinner, and kept the structure standing while someone else was quietly planning to walk out of it, I want you to hear something. Your precision was not weakness. Your steadiness was not submission. Your willingness to carry the weight was not evidence that you didn't know your own worth. It was evidence that you took your commitment seriously, and that is not a thing to be ashamed of. But there is a difference between carrying weight because you chose to, and carrying weight because you forgot you had a choice. The moment you remember, you have a choice that is not a crisis. That is the sequence beginning. Your father may not have left you a building, but someone in your life has seen you clearly enough to leave you something, a truth, a skill, a moment of recognition, a door you haven't opened yet. Look for it. Ask the question you have been not asking on purpose. The answer has been waiting in a manila folder in an office that smells like old paper and lemon furniture polish, held by someone who's been waiting for you to be ready. You are ready. The people who truly see you have always seen you. Build toward them.